That sound, it's a sound that has echoed through the darkest corridors of our collective memory for over 2 centuries. The swift, final, and chillingly efficient whisper of the guillotine. It is the very symbol of terror, the engine of the French Revolution's bloodiest chapter. When we think of state-sanctioned death, of the absolute and terrifying power of a government to extinguish a life, our minds almost inevitably conjure the image of that tall, imposing frame, the angled blade, and the waiting basket. The guillotine became an icon, a dark celebrity in the theater of history. Its name alone is enough to send a shiver down the spine. It executed a king and a queen, revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries, the brilliant and the anonymous, all with a grim and unnerving equality. It was designed, believe it or not, as a form of progress, a humanitarian leap forward. Before its invention, executions in France were a messy, brutal, and class-divided affair. The nobility were granted the privilege of a swift beheading by sword, a death of honor. But for the common man, the end was often a far more agonizing spectacle, a clumsy hanging, a slow strangulation, a display of suffering meant to cow the masses. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, the man whose name would become forever synonymous with the machine, argued for a universal method of execution, one that was quick, painless, and devoid of the torturous theatrics of the old regime. A single, clean, and democratic death for all. And in that, it succeeded. The terror of the guillotine is the terror of the inevitable. The cold, mechanical certainty of that final moment. The seconds ticking away as the blade is released. It is a horror of anticipation. But the horror itself, the physical act, lasts but a fraction of a second. It is a terrifying full stop at the end of a life. But what if I were to tell you that this symbol of ultimate terror, this machine that has haunted our nightmares, was in fact a mercy? What if I told you that in the centuries preceding the guillotine's reign, there existed a form of execution, so exquisitely cruel, so methodical in its application of pain, and so profound in its degradation of the human spirit, that it makes the sharp fall of the blade seem like a gentle release, a punishment where the goal was not simply to end a life, but to systematically, piece by piece, dismantle a human being, physically and psychologically, in full view of a jeering, captivated public. This is the story of a punishment more terrifying than the guillotine, a punishment that didn't just take a life but reveled in the process of its unmaking. It has no single, iconic name that rings through history with the same chilling clarity. It was known, simply and horribly, as the wheel. The breaking wheel. To understand the terror of the wheel, you must first erase the image of the guillotine from your mind. Forget its speed, forget its efficiency, forget its cold, impersonal nature. The wheel was the antithesis of all that. It was an intimate, hands-on, and agonizingly slow affair. It was not a machine of death, but a stage for it, and the performance could last for hours. Sometimes, for days. Picture a bustling town square in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, perhaps in 16th century Germany. The air is thick with the smells of mud, livestock, and unwashed bodies. But today, another scent hangs heavy anticipation. The square is packed. This is not a somber gathering. It's a public event, a holiday of sorts. Children are perched on their father's shoulders. Vendors hawk beer and roasted nuts. There is a palpable energy, a mixture of fear, piety, and a dark, thrilling curiosity. In the center of the square, a wooden scaffold has been erected. It is not tall and imposing like the platform for the guillotine. It is low, almost at eye level with the front rows of the crowd, and on it lies the instrument of the day's justice, a large, heavy, wooden wagon wheel, sometimes with an iron rim, its spokes thick and sturdy. It lies flat, an innocuous object of agriculture transformed into an altar of suffering. And then, the condemned is brought forth. Perhaps he is a highwayman, a murderer, or a man accused of treason against the local duke. He is likely already bloodied and bruised from the torture that extracted his confession. As he is led through the throng, he is spat upon, cursed, pelted with filth. There is no solemn procession here. This is an act of communal rejection, the first step in stripping him of his humanity. He is not a citizen on his way to face justice. He is a monster. Being paraded before his exorcism, he is forced onto the scaffold. And here, the true artistry of the executioner begins. The executioner is not a mere button pusher or a puller of levers. He is a craftsman of pain, a sculptor of broken bodies. His primary tool is not an axe or a blade, but a heavy bar of iron, or a wooden beam shod with metal. The condemned is stripped, and then he is bound. Not to the top of the wheel, not yet. He is tied to the floor of the scaffold. His limbs stretched out, often over wooden blocks, or beams placed strategically beneath his joints. His arms and legs are spread wide, forming a grotesque star. He is utterly exposed, utterly vulnerable. The crowd presses closer, their chatter hushed now, replaced by a collective, bated breath. The sentence is read aloud, detailing the crimes and the grim specifics of the punishment. And then, the executioner raises his bar. The goal of the breaking wheel was not to kill, not at first. The goal was to break. Methodically, the sentence. often specified the number and sequence of the blows. It began from the bottom up. The first strike would be aimed at the right shin. The sound, a sickening, wet crunch of shattering bone, would echo across the silent square. It would be followed by a scream, a raw, animal sound of pure agony that the brain can scarcely comprehend. Then, the left shin, then the right forearm, then the left. The executioner worked with a grim precision, a practiced rhythm. He was a percussionist playing a symphony of torment. With each blow, a limb was rendered useless, a twisted ruin of flesh, splintered bone, and blood. The crowd would watch, some wincing, some staring with wide, unblinking eyes, others shouting encouragement or damnation. This was justice as theater, a visceral lesson in the consequences of transgression. The pain would be blinding, a white-hot nova that consumed all thought. Shock would begin to set in, but the executioner knew his trade. He knew how to keep the victim conscious, how to manage the application of pain to prolong the suffering as much as possible. The breaking would continue, moving methodically up the body. The thighs, thick with muscle, would require several powerful blows. The upper arms, 9 separate breaks were common, one for each major limb joint, and a final one for the spine. Think about that for a moment. Not a single, fatal blow, but a series of calculated, non-lethal strikes designed to utterly destroy the body while keeping the mind trapped within it, fully aware, fully consumed by a universe of pain. There was a grim distinction in the sentence. A breaking from the bottom up was the standard, agonizing form. But sometimes, as an act of mercy, the sentence would call for a breaking from the top down. This meant the first blows were delivered to the neck or the chest. This was the coup de grace, the blow of grace, which would kill the victim quickly, before the breaking of their limbs. To receive the coup de grace first was a gift. To be denied, it was the true punishment. For the unlucky majority, the breaking of the limbs was only the first act. The main event was yet to come. Once the body was a broken, bleeding pulp, with the victim often still moaning, still breathing, the second phase began. The executioner and his assistants would unbind the shattered form from the scaffold floor. And now, they would turn to the wheel. Imagine a weaver at a loom. With a sickening, practiced dexterity, they would thread the broken limbs of the still living person through the spokes of the great wheel. An arm, bent at an impossible angle, where the bone was shattered, would be woven over one spoke and under the next. A leg, now as pliable as rope, would be twisted around the rim. The body was contorted, wrapped into the very structure of the wheel, its broken anatomy conforming to the circular shape of the instrument. The human form was erased, reshaped into a monstrous parody of itself, a broken puppet tangled in its own strings. And then, the wheel was hoisted high. A heavy pole would be planted in the center of the scaffold, and the wheel, now bearing its grotesque burden, would be lifted and placed atop it, like a horrific standard. There, exposed to the elements, the victim would be left, still alive, still conscious, drifting in and out of a delirium of pain. This was the true horror of the wheel, not just the breaking, but the display. The sun would beat down on him. The cold night air would seep into his broken bones. Flies would swarm his open wounds. Birds, emboldened by his stillness, would descend to peck at his flesh. He was no longer a man. He was a living scarecrow, a public monument to the power of the state. He could hear the sounds of the town below him, the laughter, the commerce, the mundane continuation of the life that he had been so violently ejected from. How long could someone survive this? It's a question that borders on the unanswerable, a testament to the terrifying resilience of the human body. Sometimes, it was hours. Sometimes, if the initial blows had caused significant internal bleeding, death would come relatively quickly from shock and blood loss. But often, it was much longer. There are accounts of victims lasting for an entire day, their moans and pleas growing weaker and weaker until they finally faded into silence. There are even more extreme, though perhaps apocryphal, tales of victims lasting 2 or even 3 days, kept alive by a horrifying combination of a strong constitution and a sentence that explicitly forbade anyone from offering them water. They would die of dehydration, their tongues swollen in their mouths, their final hours a slow, torturous descent into madness. Let's put a name to this unimaginable suffering. Let's talk about Peter Stump, the so-called werewolf of Bedburg. In 1589, in a small town near Cologne, Germany, Stump, a wealthy farmer, was accused of a series of horrific murders and of being a werewolf. Under torture, he confessed to a litany of heinous crimes, claiming a magical girdle from the devil allowed him to transform into a wolf. His confession, extracted under duress, was likely a paranoid fantasy born of superstition and agony, but the reality of his punishment was all too real. The official pamphlet detailing his execution is one of the most chilling documents from the era. On October 31, 1589, Peter Stump was brought to the place of execution. First, the executioners used hot pincers to tear flesh from 10 places on his body. Then, he was bound to the scaffold. With a wooden axe, they broke his arms and legs. According to the account, he endured the breaking without making a sound. a detail that only adds another layer of horror to the scene. And while he was still alive, still conscious, after having his flesh torn and his limbs systematically shattered, he was beheaded. His body was then burned. But the spectacle didn't end there. His daughter and mistress, accused as accomplices, were flayed and strangled, and the wheel was set up in the fields, with the figure of a wolf upon it. And on the very top of the pole, they placed the severed head of Peter Stump, a final, gruesome warning to any who might dare to challenge the natural or divine order. The story of Peter Stump, while extreme, reveals the core purpose of the wheel. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about purification and propaganda. Stump was accused of being a monster, so he was unmade in a monstrous fashion. His crime was a tear in the fabric of society, and the response had to be a theatrical, brutal mending of that tear. The public execution was a ritual cleansing, a way for the community to witness the expulsion of evil and the violent reassertion of order. And this reveals the fundamental difference between the wheel and the guillotine. The guillotine was a product of the Enlightenment, a philosophy that, for all its flaws, valued reason, order, and a certain detached scientific approach to governance. It sought to remove the cruel and unusual aspects of punishment. The blade was swift and impartial. The executioner was a state functionary, not a performer. The horror was in the finality, not the process. The goal was to extinguish a life. With mechanical predictability, the breaking wheel was born from a much older, more primal world, a world where power was personal, visible, and terrifying. The local duke, the prince, the magistrate, their power wasn't an abstract concept written in a constitution. It was written on the bodies of the condemned in the town square. The wheel was an instrument of absolute, unmediated power. It said to the populace, "This is what we can do to a human body. This is the pain we can inflict. This is how long we can make you suffer before we grant you the mercy of death. Defy us, and this is your fate." The psychological impact on a society that treated this as a public holiday is difficult to fully grasp. On one hand, it was a terrifying deterrent. The sight of a man broken and left to die on a wheel would surely give pause to any would-be criminal, but on another, it created a culture desensitized to extreme violence. It turned human suffering into a form of entertainment. Fathers brought their sons to watch, to harden them, to teach them about justice and the wages of sin. It reinforced a rigid social hierarchy, where the bodies of the poor and the outcast were the raw material for demonstrations of state authority. The nobility were almost never subjected to the wheel. It was a punishment for the other, for the commoner who stepped out of line. It was a tool for maintaining a brutal and unequal social order. Imagine being a child in that crowd, seeing the raw, visceral reality of a human body being broken apart, hearing the screams, watching a man you might have seen in the market last week being transformed into a bloody, twisted effigy. What does that teach you about the value of a human life? What does it teach you about power, about justice, about pain? It teaches you that life is cheap, that power is absolute, and that justice is something that is done to you, not for you. It normalizes a level of cruelty that is almost beyond our modern comprehension. The use of the wheel wasn't a brief, forgotten fad. It was a staple of European justice. For centuries, it was widely used across the Holy Roman Empire, in France, in Sweden, in Russia, in parts of Italy. Its use persisted long after the medieval period had faded into the Renaissance and the early modern era. In France, the punishment, known as the roué, was a common sentence for aggravated murder and highway robbery, right up until 1789. The French Revolution, which brought the guillotine to prominence, was a direct reaction against this old world of theatrical, torturous justice. When the revolutionaries called for the guillotine, they were calling for an end to the breaking wheel. They were arguing that even the worst criminal deserved to die, with some semblance of dignity. In a single, swift moment, rather than being publicly dismantled over the course of an afternoon. Think about the contrast. The condemned, at the guillotine at least, faced their end with their body intact. They walked to the scaffold as a whole person. They were granted a few final moments, a last word, perhaps. The terror was immense, but it was the terror of an impending end. The victim of the wheel was denied even that. Their end began long before their death. They were forced to inhabit a ruined body, to experience their own physical destruction piece by piece. Their humanity was systematically stripped away until only a vessel of pure, unadulterated suffering remained. The terror of the wheel was not the terror of an ending, but the terror of an endless, agonizing present. So why has the guillotine captured our imagination so completely, while the wheel has largely faded into the footnotes of history? Perhaps it's because the guillotine feels more modern, more relatable in its mechanical coldness. It represents a form of organized, bureaucratic killing that we can, in some dark way, understand. It was the precursor to the industrial-scale violence of the 20th century. The wheel, by contrast, feels alien. It belongs to a world of superstition, of public spectacle, of a form of cruelty so personal and hands-on that it repels our modern sensibilities. It is easier to look at the clean, swift slice of the blade than it is to contemplate the slow, methodical shattering of bone with an iron bar. The guillotine is a story about a revolution that devoured its own children. It's a political drama, a story of ideals twisted into an instrument of mass death. The breaking wheel tells a different story. It's a story about the raw, unvarnished nature of power in a pre-modern world. It's about how societies control their populations through fear, how they use the human body as a canvas for their most brutal messages. It reminds us that for most of human history, justice was not blind. It was a spectacle, and its favorite show was the slow, deliberate, and public annihilation of a human being. When we strip it all down, the fear of the guillotine is the fear of death, a primal, understandable fear. But the fear of the wheel is something more. It is the fear of being helpless, the fear of unbearable, prolonged pain, the fear of public humiliation. It is the fear of being systematically unmade, of having your body and your dignity destroyed long before your heart finally stops beating. It is the fear, not just of dying, but of being forced to live through your own destruction. And so, we are left with a chilling thought. The next time you see the silhouette of the guillotine, that icon of revolutionary terror, remember the wheel. Remember that the national razor of France, for all its bloodshed, was seen by the people who invented it as a step forward, a move towards a more humane world. And ask yourself, what kind of world must it have been? What kind of horrors must have been commonplace for the swift, sharp fall of a blade to be considered a mercy? The answer lies there, in the town square, under the shadow of a slowly turning wheel, where the true, terrifying face of absolute power was once put on display for all to see.